Hi, I'm Barnstable County Commissioner Bill Doherty, and it's my pleasure to welcome the viewers to another edition of County Chatter. County Chatter is a program that's intended to give the viewers some sense of some of the regional programs that are happening here on Cape Cod. With me today is Paul Niedzwiecki, who's the Executive Director of the Cape Cod Commission. And as far as a full disclaimer, the Cape Cod Commission is a part of county government, and much to be confused. Sometimes Barnstable County is known by its real name, which is Cape Cod Regional Government, and of course Cape Cod Commission is certainly an important part of that. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Bill.
Paul, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is that, and another disclaimer, I did spend 6 years as a voting member of the Cape Cod Commission, and my story is that when I ran for assembly from Harwich many years ago, it was because I had an antipathy towards the Cape Cod Commission and believed that they were an impediment to legitimate opportunities for development. And although the economic development is mentioned, was it 16 times in the
17.
Act? Oh, 17. Yeah. It's gone up another number. Well, 17 times, and there's a successor of something called CC-PETSI, which was identified as an economic development agency, that people seem to forget that in terms of the commitment that that the Cape Cod Act has to to the community. And you might quote for the viewers exactly what it says about economic development in the Act.
Well, it says that we have to balance economic development with environmental protection.
So that suggests that in order to keep this special place, Cape Cod, special, in order to make sure that we take into account the reasons why all of us live here, that we have to consider that, huh?
Absolutely. I mean, we have to consider the balancing act, but sometimes the balancing act creates sort of a false sense of competition between the economy and the environment. And I think what we found out lately that the environment on the Cape is the economy.
Yeah, that alleged tension between the aims of protecting the environment and having a balanced economic development turns out that they're more symbiotic and more in sync with each other than they are in opposition. And at the end of the day, if we wanted to have a Miami, if we wanted to have let's say, a commercial resort that didn't allow for the quaint little cottages here and there, then we could have that orientation. And of course, I'll give that one example that I always like to use is for those who want to see the difference between Barnstable County and Cape Cod and Plymouth County, I say go to the Cohasset Narrows Bridge on the other end of Buzzards Bay, coming out of Buzzards Bay, and as you cross Buttermilk Bay at that point, you're looking at a junkyard, you're looking at paving on a marina that goes down to the bay, which means you get stormwater directly in the bay, and then you go a little bit further and you see another junkyard, and you see a gas station, and not a nice gas station, but let's say a cut-rate gas station. And then when you return, going the other way over these same narrows, you see the Mass Maritime Academy and that beautiful lawn and setup, and you see the the wind turbine, showing technology and application of technology. And then on the left side, you see a beach at the end of Electric Avenue. So you know that you're approaching the Cape more so than going over the bridge. But I'd like you to tell the viewers, Paul, a little bit about how you were part of the change in the paradigm at the Cape Cod Commission.
Well, prior to taking the position as the Executive Director of the Cape Cod Commission, I was the Assistant Town Manager in the largest town in Barnstable County, the town of Barnstable. Mm-hmm. And we did a lot of work on economic development and revitalization of the historic Hyannis Main Street area down there, and had a lot of interaction with the Cape Cod Commission, negotiated the first growth incentive zone really there, and was very much aware of the 21st Century Task Force and their review of the commission, and I came to have a great sense of the act itself. Like when you read the act, it really is, it's a beautiful document. It is one that we should cherish, but it's it creates an organization that needs to evolve over time. And what happened, I think, in my perspective with the commission, is it went from a planning agency that was a regional planning agency, like every other square inch of Massachusetts is covered by one, and it was given regulatory authority. And what tends to happen is that when that happens to an agency, is it becomes a regulatory agency. And I think that happened to the commission, and I think it's difficult when you read the incredible value that is in the Cape Cod Commission Act. It's difficult to see that the Cape Cod Commission could realize its full potential if it only waited in Barnstable Village for developments of a certain size to trip a threshold. Because you're not going to have the comprehensive impact and protect the regional resources that we have one parcel at a time. And so it really required a change in paradigm from being a regulatory agency that did planning to a planning agency that was really backed up by regulation.
And of course, that was the mantra that I sang when I convened the 21st Century Commission to look at the Cape Cod Commission. And at that time, I remember that I tried to recruit, with the assistance of then Mary LeClaire and Lance Lambros, try to recruit the friends, the enemies, and the people who were neutral on it, hoping that if we got everybody in the same room at the same time, that we would come to a consensus. Unfortunately, the people who were against all found other things to occupy their time and attention during the time that the people were meeting. And I think at the end there was a minority report that was generated mainly by people who didn't attend many of the sessions. So I was kind of nonplussed by that, but that's the democratic process. But the thing that came out of it was that change in paradigm, and then the next thing that happened was that we recruited you to come in, let's say, and put that in place, because Margot Fenn, who had done wonderful work let's say, when it was more of a regulatory than a planning agency, had announced her retirement, so there was an opportunity to carry that paradigm change forward. Now, you mentioned that you were the assistant town manager who was working for the Cape Cod Commission, but you also at that time were doing a lot of regional work, because you were the chair of another fond activity of mine, the wastewater collaborative. I think you were the first chair.
Yes.
You were the first chair of that, and I remember how useful it was to have someone that had one foot in an important town on the Cape, with a lot of practical sense, because you knew, do people know that you were part of the MWRA?
I was not part of the MWRA.
Oh, that's right.
When I was in college, I worked for the MWRA Advisory Board.
Okay.
But the Advisory Board is a watchdog organization, and it represents the 60 cities and towns that are part of the MWRA. So my perspective has always been a municipal perspective, mm-hmm. and one that sort of looked with a healthy degree of skepticism at agencies that went beyond those municipal boundaries. And I brought that to the town of Barnstable. I think I brought that awareness to the Cape Cod Water Protection Collaborative. And when I came in to be the executive the executive director of the Cape Cod Commission, the first thing we did in the regional policy plan was to give towns back some authority and responsibility and tools at their discretion, because there's a radical difference in the kinds of towns that we have on the Cape and their capacity to handle certain regulatory functions or others. But we created a Chapter H, which allowed towns to come in and raise thresholds on their own. We created an easier path to growth incentive zones. We created an easier path to development agreements. And so it really is up to each town now to decide how it specifically wants to interact with the regulatory program at the Cape Cod Commission.
Now, the interesting thing as you bring that up is that much of the published criticism of the Cape Cod Commission says that they want to get to that point where there's more local control.
Yeah.
And voila, that has been in place. How long have you been working for us?
6.5 years, so it's been in place for 5 years now.
Yeah, right. So for 5 years, what's gone wrong? Isn't anybody paying attention?
They do pay attention, but sometimes it's a little bit too late. And a lot of the towns and the local planning departments are really sort of overburdened in what they do. I'll give you two examples over the last 24 months. We had two companies that came through Cape Cod Commission review that really shouldn't have come through the review. One was a company called Hydroid in Bourne, and the other was Teledyne Benthos in Falmouth. They were both located in industrial service and trade areas where the towns could have raised thresholds so that they wouldn't have been reviewed by the commission on a regional level. And they both wanted to grow. Hydroid makes these really cool underwater submarines, and they're a sort of a Hui Marine Tech spinoff. They came in, they had about 60 employees. The average wage was in the mid-60s. And they had a growth projection of 5 to 10 positions a year for the next 5 to 10 years. And so we knew these were important companies to keep. This is the basis of transitioning from a seasonal economy to a year-round economy. And so we put them through in 30 days with no mitigation, and they're off and running. The president, Chris Von Alt, came in a couple of months ago to tell me that their growth projections were off because they were already at 150 positions from 60 in about 18 months. So both of those situations could have been controlled by the towns, but the towns have a lot to do. So one thing we didn't do that we remedied at the end of last year was to give the commission the ability to lower them anywhere, but to raise them so that we can be more proactive in making sure some of these economic development tools are in use and that projects that should not be regulated by the Cape Cod Commission are not. And it doesn't hurt the protection at all because the towns still have the ability to discretionarily refer any project to the commission, but it removes that mandatory review.
The old 9,999 square feet.
Where it doesn't make sense. So we look forward to exercising that in more than a couple of towns in the next 6 months, really.
I believe that before you came, there was a subcommittee that I sat on that was looking at an expansion. I don't remember if it was MBL or Hui as far as a campus expansion.
Hui.
And Hui. And it occurred to me at the time when we were sitting there that that could have certainly been handled within the town of Falmouth and not have been like a knee-jerk referral to the Cape Cod Commission.
Right.
But it would require the town to take a certain level of responsibility with regard to it. Now, in more recent times, there's the question of what's going on in Dennis, and it raises what I call a larger question. When you mention the GIZ, the growth incentive zones, how many towns have taken advantage of creating GIZs? Well,
we have a growth incentive zone in Barnstable and Hyannis. We have one along 28 in Yarmouth for a particular purpose, a hotel motel that produced the New Hampton Inn down there. There's been tens of millions of dollars invested in the Hyannis Growth Incentive Zone, and we just did one in Buzzards Bay in Bourne last year, and they've got some active investors out there now. So we know that this kind of discrete focus in areas that need to be redeveloped, which are generally the hardest areas to have vital economic development happen, we know that this works in creating these little holes where it's appropriate. And we're more sophisticated in our approach now as towns and as a region. So these are not difficult things to do. Then we should do more of them.
We have 15 towns, and you've only mentioned 3 towns that have taken advantage of the GIZ. And when you mentioned Buzzards Bay, I know that there are great plans, because I think I sit on the RTA board. We have great plans of expanding the Cape Flyer, which means that if we expand it to the point of perhaps considering commuter rail, we'll need parking, and there needs to be some consideration of how would you develop a parking garage on, let's say, on this side of the canal in Buzzards Bay in order to accommodate what would be, with parking, because right now all of the parking lots that are available are privately held, and they're you would be competing with the use of those parking lots for the retail businesses, that are there. So there does need to have some level of integration. Talk a little bit more about the activity that's going on in Buzzards Bay right now.
Well, you know, we've worked with them. Buzzards Bay, the biggest challenge they have to development down there is so much of it's in the floodplain.
Yes.
But they've done a lot. There's been a ton of great local planning done by the town of Bourne there, and they know what they want to be. So we gave consideration to their application for a growth incentive zone, and I think it was a great plan in the end. And so now the town has the authority, based on a certain number of residential units and commercial square footage, to put it where it thinks it fits best with the existing infrastructure and in the best way to stimulate its commercial tax base. So, and to really direct that incentive to Buzzards Bay. And we know that redevelopment is more expensive than greenfield development.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why opening these growth incentive zones in a particular geography in a town tends to make a lot of sense.
Now, you've done a lot with creating an inventory of potential open space that could be used for commercial purposes, open space that could be perhaps for target development for wastewater management issues. And right now there's a program in place that as soon as the weather clears up, we're going to do a flyover where we're going to have a picture of the whole Cape. If we weren't doing that, how would that get done?
Well, the regional flyover is every town does one. You've got to have that as a base layer to do a lot of your planning, a lot of infrastructure planning, utility planning, town planning. And so in the past, every town has really had an individual contract. They put up a separate plane. So 15 planes flying over the Cape at different levels of resolution to give us a complete picture of the Cape that was out of focus at best, with holes in it.
Well, that would be like a super Google, right? Because you heard me complain about that. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's at a level of resolution without some of the copyright issues that we would have. All the towns do it, and then they pull down what's called planimetrics for it, so that we can see where all the utility lines are, where the drainage is. Stormwater is going to be a big issue. Stormwater management coming up, and wastewater. You know, all of these, you need that base layer of information at a very high resolution in order to make the best decisions possible. But our collective action, really, with the county as the backbone to that, saved over $1 million for the Cape, and it seemed to be a no-brainer.
Wait a minute, let's see. It cost $2.5 million to, let's say, to set up your agency.
Yeah.
Okay, for the baseline stuff, and then that would be what we're talking about, 18 to 20 bucks per household if we figure there's 100,000 households. And I seem to remember that. See, when I was on the Cape Cod Commission, it was about 15 bucks per household, and that was over 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Gee, you know, if you take into account, if I'm remembering my money and banking courses up at Babson, that would mean that it's costing us less money in terms of constant dollar value today to run the Cape Cod Commission than it did 10 years ago.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And actually, in 23 years, in 1991, the average cost annually to a single-family household was $15.
Okay.
So per household, that same cost now is $20. So $5 increase per household per year over 23 years. And if you do if you adjust for inflation, we actually cost less now than when we did 23 years ago, and that's a good deal for the Cape. And every town in Massachusetts pays a townwide assessment into a regional planning agency. So there's nothing new about that. The difference would be the Cape Cod Commission is capped on any increase it could seek at 2.5% a year, and that's why we have this structural deficit. Martha's Vineyard Commission, on the other hand, is not capped, nor are other regional planning agencies at how much they can request on an annual basis. So it forces us to be more entrepreneurial as a government agency.
Are you telling me that because you're part of the county, as opposed to being an independent agency that reports to Boston, almost like a regional school district where the control of your cost is not within the authority of let's see, of the people that you're serving, if you're in Martha's Vineyard, as opposed to being on Cape Cod, with the Cape Cod Commission where it is well within the authority of control, limited by a 2.5% increase by statute. And we don't have the ability to go for an override.
No.
So the only thing you can do is you have to go either take your begging bowl up to the feds and get grants. And by the way, I don't think you'd be able to survive on the $2.5 million that we get from the towns. I think that maybe you ought to talk a little bit about how the success that you've had since you've been, in the last 6 years of finding money that helps us operate here in the county for what you're doing.
Well, we have to be, given the financial structure that's set up. We have to be good at finding money. And my experience in the public sector is really, if you have a good idea, ultimately you can get it funded. And so we've been able to do that through collaboration, coordinated efforts. We got the largest award for a Community Innovation Challenge grant to start the e-permitting program on the Cape, where we are leading the Commonwealth. We brought in $3.2 million last year to help us deal with our biggest environmental issue, and I think our biggest economic issue, which is wastewater and nitrogen. And we're developing a plan now, this 208 plan, pursuant to Section 208 of the Clean Water Act, that a draft will be ready in June. We put that together in a year.
Talk a little bit more about the specifics of the application of the 208 plan.
Yeah, the 208 plan is really to look regionally at all the efforts. There's been a ton of good local planning that's happened over the last 10 years on the Cape. But moving towards implementation is difficult because we have 216,000 year-round residents. And when you have to construct traditional wastewater facilities, you run into what's known as a peak flow pricing issue. You have to build for maximum capacity, which, given the seasonal nature of the Cape, happens 4 weeks out of the year, the last 2 weeks of July, first 2 weeks of August. So in many respects, an inordinate amount of that capital infrastructure is being borne on the backs of 216,000 year-round residents. And the state requires each town to come up with a plan to its municipal borders. So it doesn't account for shared watersheds, and it makes them plan 20, 30 plus years out in a way that the price tags seem huge. So we have been able to use the 208 plan not just to coordinate a lot of that good local planning, but to introduce a way that we can use alternative methods that are non-traditional and not as concrete.
Could you describe what you mean by non-traditional?
The traditional way to deal with wastewater is by sewering. Right. And so there's a collection system, there's a treatment facility, and then there's a disposal need there. The basic premise of the 208 plan is that it is not doable unless it's affordable. So the primary way to make it affordable is to keep as many people on properly operating Title V systems and on-site wastewater disposal as possible.
I think that's an important point to make for people.
Yeah, that is the goal of the plan, is to keep as many people on their existing systems as possible to not build what we don't need. And so we have been looking at other technologies, other on-site technologies, innovative alternative on-site technologies that George Hoyfelder at Barnstable County Health Department tests at Joint Base Cape Cod, and other more limited approaches, and then some of the low-hanging fruit like dredging, increased natural flushing, permeable reactive barriers. How can we deal with this nitrogen issue in a way where we see results quicker in the degraded water bodies and at a lower cost to homeowners long term? And so we've been able to do that, and there's enough faith in the professionalism behind this plan and the strategies that we're starting to see, and we saw this in Falmouth a couple of months ago, the state and the feds taking a more flexible approach to how communities can permit and build these projects.
Well, when you mention dredging, the first thought that comes in mind is if we have, let's say, dredged out harbors, we've changed the characteristics. Changing the characteristics changes, some of the environmental applications, and there seems to be a need for having more insight as to, let's say, specific approaches to resolving problems that have occurred because we've tried to improve the characteristics of a place.
And I think the ocean management plan that we put in place a couple of years back looked at how we're going to deal with some of these coastal resources, and the discussion is beginning now at how we can look at issues like coastal erosion and sediment management and do it on our terms. And I think that will lead to a much more effective strategy in remedying some of the environmental problems that have been caused by that kind of development.
Well, one of the things that you're probably aware of, the Coastal Resources Committee had come in and asked the county for support in soliciting the designation of the Cape as being let's say a zone of concern in order to open up the opportunity for federal funding to address that. And we did send that letter off, I think last week, even though there were some concern about the agricultural issues, which were really non-issues, because if you read what we were asked to do, you would understand that any action that would take place would go for review, because there was the element that the regional planning agency, the Cape Cod Commission, would be involved, and there is a greater sensitivity to agricultural application as in the last 10 years, because I seem to remember when Leo and I were both serving on it, that's when those parts were incorporated into the comprehensive plan. So you've got that, the economic development piece is incorporated into that. So to me, the Cape Cod Commission does not come up with one size fits all.
No.
And they have, and even when it was, the paradigm was planning, regulation first, even then it wasn't all one size fits all. There was some sensitivity to the differences in the demographics and the geography of the Cape, and anybody that takes a look at the glacial till on one side of the Cape versus the sandbars on the other side of the Cape, knows that that it's a different place. There are actually, in terms of, there are three different parts of the Cape. There's the upper Cape that might be compared to a suburb. There's the urban part that would be the center of the Cape, with the commercial development, and then there's the rural outer Cape, with what people look at when they look at the Cape. They're usually looking at the national seashore, and they're saying that that this is what the Cape looks like. But the Cape has many different looks in many different places, and we certainly hear that, because in some cases it's not a case of having 15 towns, it's 15 little kingdoms that happen to be joined together on this peninsula. And speaking as I wear two other hats, as you know. I'm the Massachusetts representative to the board of directors of the National Association of County Officials, and we are the envy. We are the envy of other counties because of the success of our planning agency and being able to keep our county the way it is. And at the Mass Municipal Association, when I go there and I talk to Franklin and what's the other? Oh, Hampshire, their planning commissions, they also have great envy of the fact that we, because you're part of the county, that we have the support of the community to get the things done that need to be done. So I guess the final question is, what is everybody worried about?
Well,
and you got 30 seconds.
We have a historic healthy skepticism of government at any level. There are many ways to participate in the process and to help the commission evolve. And I would encourage people to do that. I think we're in a much better place now than we have been, and we're continuing to try to make improvements.
Well, with that, I want to thank you, Paul, for coming. You have to know that I have evolved in many ways, but the one thing I would suggest to anybody that's concerned about the commission is that they read the act, and if in failing to read the act, it's available to you. Just go to the Cape Cod Commission webpage. That's also accessed through barnstablecounty.org, and you'll find out everything you need to know about what both the intention, what the mission, what the vision of the Cape Cod Commission is. And also you can find out something about the comprehensive planning that's going on. And we don't get here all by ourselves. It is a mutual activity that's supported by representatives from every town on the Cape, that has oversight through the Assembly of Delegates and the county commissioners, also representing all of the Cape. So there are many checks and balances, And all you have to remember is look at how we look now. We look that way because of successful planning. And with that, I want to thank Paul for coming.